this course on vulnerability management. In this video, I'll be covering our second objective, which is the difference between vulnerability management and vulnerability assessment. In my previous video, I spoke about our first objective, which is the definition of vulnerability management. All right, let's dive into today's course. All right, so what is vulnerability assessment? What's the difference between both of them? In the course of my career, I noticed that a lot of people tend to mix vulnerability management. They feel vulnerability management is the same as vulnerability assessment, but they are not. Looking at my previous definition on vulnerability management, I said vulnerability management is the process by which you identify, evaluate, remediate, and provide reports on security vulnerabilities. All right, so vulnerability assessment, what it does, it helps you to identify specifically vulnerability, helps you to identify vulnerability in that whole chain. So it's a tool that you can use to identify vulnerability or weaknesses that pose a threat to an organization. And there are different types of vulnerability assessment that could be done, and depending on the segment or where you actually want that assessment to be done. So I itemized 7. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to provide a little bit of overview on each of these assessments. There are a lot of information you can actually read up online to get to have more detail, but the goal of this is just to identify the different types of assessment that could be done. Alright, so the first one is networks. For networks, it covers network infrastructure devices. So for your firewalls, your switches, your routers, your servers, your environment. And what that does is that it helps you to identify the vulnerabilities in those devices. So let me use firewall for example. So for firewalls, one of the things that if you're doing an assessment on your firewall is to perform a firewall rule review, meaning that it checks all of your rules to see if there's any form of a rule that could pose a threat to your organization. So for example, an IP any type of rule, it poses a threat. Ideally, you should have a block of subnets that would allow traffic from a source to a specific destination as well. So, but it all depends on how the organization is actually structured and what you're trying to achieve. So for firewall, we also tend to check things around the ports that are actually open, ports that are allowed on the firewall. So ports, for example, like a telnet port, for example, to try and check those firewall rules to see if there are any of those kind of access rules that allow such protocols in your network. So it's actually a very, very broad type of assessment. It depends on the scope of what you're trying to achieve. But however, that's what networks type of vulnerability assessment tends to cover. It also tends to cover the firmware running on those devices, if they're actually running on the current version, and if they're not, it tends to provide you with the details that the version running on these devices are probably end of life or they need to be passed. So it provides you with those kind of details. But like I said, it depends on the scope of what you're trying to achieve with that type of assessment. So for physical provides an assessment that's done on the physical site. So what happens is that the assessment tends to cover the physical site, see if there are any threats peculiar to that particular environment where the site is located, and also checks the physical controls in place, if there's specific controls that are in place and those that might be missing based on those assessments. So physical controls such as cameras, motion detectors, guards, access doors. So it all depends on that particular site, and the essence is to ensure that the controls you have in place would be able to mitigate against the threats should in case they tend to happen in that environment and to that physical site. And also for database tend to cover database type of assessments. It's an assessment that is run on database solutions, and it tends to check for known vulnerabilities such as SQL injection, the use of default credentials, if the database is running on the current version or it needs to be patched, and things like that. So those tools, they run on specifically on databases, and they tend to identify those vulnerabilities and provide recommendations as to how to ensure that those vulnerabilities are remediated. And for web and mobile application, it refers to testing web application and mobile application for known vulnerabilities that are peculiar to those types of application. So OWASP, meaning Open Web Application Security Projects, it's a body of security professionals that they came up with the top 10 known vulnerabilities that is common to mobile application and also web applications. And they also have their own tools. They have ZAP, Z Attack Proxy, which is used for to carry out this particular assessments on the mobile application, also on the web application. All right. Also for endpoints, endpoint tend to focus on devices such as your laptops, desktop, your mobile phones, your tablets, and things like that. And what the focus is more is that it tends to ensure that those devices are actually safe from possible known threat. And we can talk about endpoint without talking about EDRs and XDR. EDR has to do with endpoints detection and response, and XDR has to do with extended detection and response. So what this tool, what they do is that they are agent based. So they install those agents on those devices, and those agents tend to monitor those devices, and they provide information to the central location. So they detect malicious activities, and they tend to provide responses. For extended, they provide it's more robust because it provides more capabilities to cloud solutions, provide visibility into those devices, and it tends to provide a centralized location. It tends to report those any known threat or any malicious activity to the centralized location, and the administrator can apply specific policies to respond to such vulnerabilities or such activities. So Active Directory focuses on on-premise directory or the cloud, which is Azure Active Directory. So for on-premise, Microsoft is a big player in this space. They tend to ensure that they provide some checklists whereby you can run them against your Active Directory, and to see if you're running if the configuration, if your Active Directory is adding enough to defend against possible known threats to Active Directory. And also for wireless, wireless focuses on testing known wireless attacks on your wireless devices. Could be your wireless controller or your wireless access points themselves. In my subsequent video, we'll be looking at some of the tools that could be used to address some of this type of assessment. Alright, I hope this video is valuable to you. Thank you very much for viewing, and I'll see you in my next video.